Britain won this war, and it nearly destroyed her. It was the longest war Britain ever fought in India, the most expensive by a mile. It cost so much money, it helped bankrupt one of the most powerful companies the world has ever seen. And it killed British and Indian soldiers in their thousands. But here's the part that should stop you cold. Most of those men were never killed by the enemy at all. They never even got the chance to fight. Something else was waiting for them out there, something far deadlier than any Burmese soldier, and it took them apart. This is a war almost nobody in Britain remembers. No famous battle, no statue you'd recognize, no line in the school books. And yet for the men who were sent to fight it, it was one of the most nightmarish campaigns the British Army ever endured. A war that was technically a victory and felt like a disaster. By the end of this video, you'll know how Britain ended up at war with Burma, why winning it cost so much it broke a financial empire, and what really killed the men who marched in when the Burmese army barely had to lift a finger. This is the forgotten war between Britain and Burma. If you love the forgotten corners of British history, the true stories nobody tells, do me a favour and subscribe. It's free and it keeps this channel going. Right, let's get into it. First, picture the board in the early 1820s. On one side, the British East India Company, not really a company anymore in any normal sense, but a vast private empire with its own armies, swallowing India piece by piece. And on the other side, to the east, the Kingdom of Burma, ruled by the powerful Konbaung Dynasty, an ambitious, expanding empire in its own right, proud and confident and used to winning. And these two hungry empires were growing toward each other along a long, blurry, ill-defined border. Burma had been pushing west, conquering territory in places like Assam and Manipur on the edges of what the British considered their patch. Refugees and rebels spilled across the frontier in both directions. Raids led to counter-raids, and neither side was in any mood to back down. The spark came over a tiny scrap of land. In 1823, Burmese forces occupied a small island near Chittagong on the border that the British claimed as their own. There was a skirmish, more clashes followed, and in March 1824, Britain declared war. But let's be honest about why, because this channel doesn't do flag waving. Yes, Britain wanted to secure that frontier. But the deeper reasons were the usual ones. The company wanted new markets for British goods. It wanted Burma's resources, its teak, its trade. And it wanted to shut the French out of the region. This wasn't really about an island. It was about empire and money. And the Burmese, for their part, were not afraid. They had a commander who was genuinely brilliant, a general named Maha Bandula. And Bandula was no pushover defending his home. He was thinking about attack. He had a plan to drive into British Bengal itself, and by some accounts he spoke of marching all the way to Calcutta, the very heart of British India, and on to England itself if that's what it took. This was a confident enemy who believed he could win, so the British made a bold move. Rather than just fight along the land border, they loaded an army of around 11,000 men onto ships and sailed straight for the Burmese coast, aiming to strike at the soft underbelly and march up toward the Burmese capital at Ava. In May 1824, that seaborne force arrived at the great port city of Rangoon, and they took it without a fight. That sounds like a triumph. It was a trap. Because the Burmese had done something the British never expected. They didn't defend Rangoon, they abandoned it. The population melted away into the countryside, and they took everything with them, the food, the supplies, the boats, everything of use. The British marched into a great city and found a stripped, empty shell. No enemy to defeat, no supplies to seize, just an abandoned town on a hostile coast with the rainy season coming. And that is where this war reveals its true, horrifying nature, because the British had walked into the deadliest enemy of all, and it wasn't an army. It was the land itself. The monsoon came, and with it, the real killer. The climate of Burma, the heat, the soaking humidity, the flooded ground, the rotting jungle was lethal to soldiers who had no immunity to it and no proper supplies to sustain them. And out of that environment came the diseases: malaria, dysentery, cholera, fevers that swept through the camps and emptied them. Men who had sailed in fit and ready began to sicken and die in their hundreds, then their thousands, in an abandoned city without ever firing a shot in a real battle. Let me give you the numbers because they are genuinely staggering and they are the whole point of this story. Around 40,000 British and Indian troops served in this war. Over 15,000 of them died, but of those deaths only a small fraction were caused by combat. Around 70% of the men who died of disease. Not Burmese muskets, not Burmese cannon. Tropical sickness in the heat and the mud. And if you want a single figure that captures the horror of it, here it is. There were 5 British regiments that served in Burma. One of them went in with 3,586 men. By the end, 3,115 of them were dead. Stop and let that land. Out of a regiment of over 3,500, only around 470 survived. That is not a casualty rate you associate with a war Britain supposedly won easily. That is annihilation delivered almost entirely by mosquitoes and disease. Meanwhile, the actual fighting ground on, General Bandula and his Burmese forces resisted hard. They were brave, and they were skilled in their own way, preferring to fight from strong wooden stockades and to ambush in the jungle they knew far better than the invaders did. But here was the gap that decided it. The British had modern artillery, naval power, and the bottomless resources of India behind them. The Burmese guns were often old, their gunnery poor, and whenever they were forced to fight the British in the open, British training and firepower usually won. It's worth saying clearly because the men who were there said it themselves, the British did not think little of their enemy. One British officer in the campaign, a man who would later become a famous novelist, formed a high opinion of the Burmese, calling them intelligent, brave, and cheerful, the finest race in Asia. This was a respected enemy, fighting hard for their own land. They were simply outgunned and worn down by a war of attrition that India's vast resources allowed Britain to sustain through 2 brutal rainy seasons. The turning point came at a place called Danubyu in 1825. The Burmese massed a huge force there under Bandula to stop the British advance up the great Irrawaddy River. And in the middle of the battle, General Maha Bandula, the heart and soul of the Burmese war effort, was killed. By most accounts, he was struck down by a British rocket or shell as he walked among his defences, deliberately out in the open, trying to steady his men and keep their courage up. With his death, the spirit went out of the Burmese resistance. Their armies fell into retreat, and the British pushed relentlessly up the river toward the capital. By early 1826, with British forces closing in on Ava itself, the Burmese king had no choice left. He sued for peace, and the terms were crushing. The treaty that ended the war was signed in a small village called Yandabo in February 1826, and it stripped Burma bare. Burma had to hand over vast territories, Arakan, Assam, Manipur, and the Tenasserim coast. It had to give up its claims to other frontier lands. It had to accept a British representative at its court and sign a trade deal opening it up to British commerce. And on top of all that, it had to pay an enormous indemnity, £1 million in gold and silver. Now, £1 million was a colossal sum even in Europe at the time, but in Burma it was almost unimaginable. Converted into the local currency, it came to 10 million kyat in a country where an ordinary villager in the north lived on about 1 kyat a month. The payment didn't just hurt the Burmese crown, it bankrupted the royal treasury for years. It was a national humiliation and an economic wound that would not heal. So Britain won. On the map, it was a clear victory. New territory, a defeated enemy, a one-sided treaty. But now look at what that victory actually cost the winner, because this is the twist that makes the whole war so strange. The war had been so ruinously expensive, somewhere between 5 and 13 million pounds, that it threw British India into a severe financial crisis. The strain helped push the East India Company toward disaster. Within a few years, that crisis would contribute to the company losing its prized trade privileges and seeing its power crippled. The mightiest commercial empire in the world had won a war, and the cost of winning it had helped to break it. And it didn't even end there. This forgotten, ruinous war was only the first of 3. Having taken a bite out of Burma, the British came back for more in a second war in 1852 and a third in 1885, each time taking another piece until finally the entire kingdom of Burma was swallowed whole into the British Empire, the ancient Konbaung Dynasty extinguished. So why does nobody remember it? Maybe because there's no clean glory in it, no heroic charge to put on a postcard. It's a story of men dying of fever in an abandoned city, of a victory that helped bankrupt the victor, of an enemy who was respected and crushed all at once, of a war fought for markets and teak and empire. It doesn't fit the tidy story we like to tell, but it was real, it was enormous, and for the men who were sent into that jungle and never came home, it was as deadly as any war Britain ever fought. The longest, the most expensive, and very nearly the most pointless, the forgotten war between Britain and Burma. A quick honest note before you go, because this channel doesn't deal in fairy tales. The figures here, the troop numbers, the deaths, above all the cost of the war, do vary between sources. You'll see the price tag quoted anywhere from 5 million to 13 million pounds, and the Burmese casualties were never properly counted at all and are simply unknown. The exact way General Bandula died, by rocket or by shell, is told slightly differently in different accounts, but the heart of it is rock solid and well documented, and this really was the longest and most expensive war in the history of British India. Disease really did kill far more men than combat. One regiment really was almost wiped out. And the financial damage really did help cripple the East India Company. The horror of it is not exaggerated. So here's my question for you. Drop it in the comments. Thousands of these men died of disease in a war most of their own countrymen have completely forgotten. Do you think a war like this, won on paper but catastrophic in reality, should really be remembered as a victory at all? I read every reply, and if you want more forgotten history of Britain in the wider world, there's a video waiting for you right on screen. I'll see you in it.